What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. With the release of Black Adam, it's time to rank every DCEU movie along with Peacemaker from worst to best. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your ranking of the DCEU movies are. As always, this is just my list and not a definitive ranking. Also, make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these videos, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with more movie-related content on a near daily basis. We have 12 movies and one show to rank, so let's not waste any more time, and let's jump into the list. In last place is Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice, and whether it's the theatrical cut or the extended edition, this is a film that I can commend for trying a lot. But I'll be quite honest, this one just does not click for me. I find it to be a film that suffers from trying to be too many things at once. It wants to be a Man of Steel sequel, as well as a Justice League prequel, along with actually trying to focus some time on the showdown between the two title characters all in one movie. And because of that, it's just all over the place, even if you take the Ultimate Edition into account, where it expands on things a little better and is definitely an improvement over the theatrical cut, but it still results in an uneven experience. For every moment that might be emotionally compelling or thrilling, it's undercut by this overly depressing tone that makes it a bit of a slog to get through. And while I commend it for trying to focus on this philosophical aspect regarding the nature of gods and superheroes and their place in the world, I never found any of those conversations to be anything meaningful, and it all amounted to word salad if you ask me. On top of that, I am really not a fan of Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor at all. I gave him a chance when I heard that casting announcement. I don't think he's incapable of playing villainous characters, but his performance here just does not work for me. He tries to have his cake and eat it too, with being just a little over the top, but also being a little grounded at the same time, and he doesn't really fully commit in either direction, so instead he just comes off as annoying, and it makes him one of my least favorite villains in this entire franchise, with Doomsday also being pretty underwhelming as well. With it only being the second DCEU film, and with it trying to do way too much at once, to me, all this was just a clear sign of DC being caught with their pants down and simply trying to play catch up with Marvel rather than actually try telling a great story, making for what I feel is a misfire of a film. Number 12, Wonder Woman 1984, which, while not terrible, is still a very disappointing follow-up to the 2017 hit, and I definitely like it a little less the more I think about it, to be quite honest. Now, I liked how it does try going for the feel of the Richard Donner era Superman, and for the most part, it's got some really nice visuals. The first half hour or so I thought was really solid, but in general, the film suffers from an unimaginative plot with two villains who weren't quite done justice. While Kristen Wiig does what she can, Cheetah essentially just plays into a tired trope reminiscent of Poison Ivy and Batman and Robin, and Electro in Amazing Spider-Man 2, among others, and it's predictable as ever, and it doesn't offer any sort of unique spin on the trope. And while Pedro Pascal was great, and he's one of the biggest saving graces of this entire movie, Maxwell Lord as a villain wasn't really utilized the best, as all he ever really amounts to is just a guy who becomes this wish machine, and that's it. Now, while there were a lot of cool fight scenes that were genuinely entertaining, it's also way too long, with a lot of plot points being really dragged out. The one in particular that did not work at all is the storyline between Diana and the revived Steve Trevor, where, as the audience, we see Chris Pine, but in actuality, it's him taking over the body of this random stranger who's not in control of himself and is completely unaware of it, so it leads to a lot of story beats that are just really creepy. So while overall this is sporadically entertaining, it's easily one of the least endearing of all these films. At number 11 is 2016's Suicide Squad, and as a point of reference, from here on out, all these projects are stuff that I at least thought were decent and I wouldn't mind revisiting. Now with this film, while it obviously is one of the weaker DCEU efforts in my opinion as seen by this ranking, it really isn't truly as bad as everyone says it is. With this being the third DCEU movie, when you watch this right after seeing Man of Steel, which I do like, along with Dawn of Justice, it's tonally actually a little refreshing, even if still uneven, because this is the first time we see a film actually try balancing out the grittier aspects with a sense of levity, and we see that especially with Will Smith and Margot Robbie. And while not the entire cast was utilized the most effectively, like, it's still especially jarring seeing this version of Rick Flag, who's very underwhelming considering the major improvement we got with him in The Suicide Squad, I do think the cast and the chemistry among all of them really kept this film together. There's a strong group dynamic presented that made them fun to watch. Plus, while I know there was some studio interference with this, you still see some of David Ayer's strengths shine through just a bit, with some fun, entertaining action scenes, especially in the first half. And honestly, I think it started off strong enough that it initially had me thinking this might have been one of the better efforts in the DCEU. Though ultimately, where the film loses steam for me is that once it hits the hour mark, it does get muddled a bit. The plot starts drifting off in a few different directions, with the group splitting apart and shifting the focus on the villains like Enchantress and the Joker. But losing that group dynamic does hurt things a bit, and I really didn't particularly care for either of these villains, with Enchantress being just not interesting enough, while this iteration of the Joker is quite possibly one of the worst and most annoying aspects of the DCEU. Like, I think Dawn of Justice is overall not as good of a movie, but Jared Leto here is worse as the Joker than Jesse Eisenberg is as Luthor. So once we get to the second half, it definitely fizzles out a bit, though the cast at least do a solid enough job to keep things afloat. So in the end, I do think the good outweighs the bad, and this actually is a film I wouldn't mind revisiting. I just don't think it's anywhere near as good as it could have been. Number 10, Black Adam. Dwayne Johnson's big passion project that was in development before either the first DCEU or even the first MCU film was released. And once you realize that piece of information, it becomes quite clear when watching the film, as this feels like something that could have easily been released in the mid-2000s, where, besides the Nolan Batman movies and to an extent the X-Men movies, superhero films weren't all these major deconstructions or necessarily always the deepest of cinema, and instead kept things squarely focused on action, humor, and spectacle. And that both works and doesn't work here. This works really nicely as some solid popcorn entertainment. It's mostly to the point, it's funny, it's got a number of really fun action scenes, and it also works nicely as a standalone superhero movie. Like, even though there are clear references to other parts of the DCEU, and we even get some appearances from returning characters, you could not watch any other DCEU movie before seeing this, and you could still follow this very easily. So that's great, especially since most of the focus is on lesser known DC characters who don't get the spotlight all too often, like the Justice Society. That being said, anytime it chooses to focus on anything even remotely emotionally compelling, because it doesn't stay on some things for too long, there are moments that'll either feel rushed, glossed over, or if it's supposed to have emotional weight, it'll just feel like a hollow exposition dump that we don't get to fully take in because it just moves on so quickly. Like, I appreciate it tries keeping things to the point and moving along, but there were a couple of times it could have benefited from staying on something for even like an extra 30 seconds or so, and it would have gone a long way. Plus, with that, there were some moments of some pretty bad acting from some of the non-superhero characters. Like, I did not particularly care for the main kid who tries getting Black Adam to help him out. We also have a really weak and uninteresting villain, as well as some jarring moments of clunky editing that will take you out of the moment. Still, despite the issues, it's a fun enough time, and I liked it. I just think it could have delivered more, especially for how long in development it was. Number 9, and I'm already bracing for the hate comments, is 2017's Justice League, also known as Justice League by some, due to the fact that, despite Zack Snyder being credited as director, Joss Whedon had a lot more involvement than initially led to believe, and there was some heavy studio interference by Warner Brothers. This is a movie that, for many, if you don't have it at either the bottom spot or even the second worst spot, it essentially invalidates the entire list for them, considering the nature behind how the studio interfered. And I totally get it, as I am not a proponent of studio interference whatsoever. That being said, honestly, I'd be lying if I said I hated the final product, because I really don't. Now, I don't like what Warner Brothers did, but I don't dislike the actual movie. Is it the iconic movie that we should have got with it being the first time in live action on the big screen we're seeing the Justice League all together? No, by no means it's not. It can definitely be tonally uneven, and it can certainly move way too quickly, primarily due to a mandate from the studio to keep this at 2 hours. But while there's a clashing of styles on display, I did like, similar to Suicide Squad, it did at least try to have some fun between its solid action scenes and a decent sense of humor. And for the record, even if all the jokes don't work, personally, I'd much rather see a superhero movie try to be too funny rather than be joyless and somber. I know a lot of people don't appreciate any of the characters making all these jokes here, but I really didn't mind them, and I thought they kinda worked for the most part. To me, this is still an entertaining enough movie overall, but to be clear, despite that, this still does have its issues, like a weak villain in Steppenwolf, as well as some thinly written storylines that were the result of a lot of being cut out of it. And a lot of that would be corrected with the next film on this list. And that would be the Snyder Cut, which is the vision for this story Zack Snyder originally had in mind, brought to fruition by a fan-led movement. It removes all the footage shot by Joss Whedon, it adds some new footage, while also restoring all the scenes cut from the original, which results in a 4-hour movie. Now again, I know I'm definitely going to get some hate for this, putting it so low on the list and only just above the theatrical version, but I will be clear. Obviously, this is the better of the two versions of the story, mainly due to the fact it tells a much more complete story. Steppenwolf's motivations are made much clearer, character arcs are fleshed out, it's visually stunning, and the action scenes felt more epic. Like, while I found the action scenes fun enough in the theatrical version, the way they're done here is so much better, and all the action scenes added were just beautifully done. That being said, it's also a 4-hour movie, which winds up being both a good and bad thing. While it does flesh everything you needed to out, you also had subplots placed in here that were so long that they could have been removed and made into their own film, which speaks to the larger problem of Warner Brothers trying to cram in as much as possible in the early days of the DCEU, just to catch up with Marvel, rather than focus on proper world building and taking their time. I think splitting some of this stuff off would have made everything flow a lot better. It's more coherent for sure, don't get me wrong there, and it's definitely emotionally compelling, but it's just too much for one movie if you ask me. Plus, I'll be honest, I don't dislike Zack Snyder, but I'm honestly not a huge fan of him being totally left up to his own devices. Because here, we get way too many scenes of him doing his usual slow-mo to give a more dramatic feel, but a lot of the times they'd be for sequences where it just didn't quite feel justified, and it definitely dragged things out at times. So along with the film just trying to do a lot story-wise, a number of sequences definitely overstay their welcome. That being said, it still is a good movie overall. Maybe not quite one I'll immediately want to sit back down with again right away due to its length, but I like it, and I respect it, and I'm glad Snyder at least got to tell the story he wanted to tell. Number 7, Man of Steel, the film to kick everything off that was a solid jumpstart to the DCEU, mainly due to the fact that it was originally conceived as a standalone story. Warner Brothers really didn't fast-track a cinematic universe until after the film was already made. So while they tried rectifying that in later films in a way that I felt totally didn't work, at least what we got here was a film strictly focused on building up the Superman lore and exploring his origins, his mindset, and just what makes him tick, while also being a gripping blockbuster. And for the most part, it succeeds. While it does try a bit too hard at times to feel like a Christopher Nolan movie, with Nolan himself having produced the film, and maybe it can be a bit too somber at times, it's actually a lot more endearing than I think people give it credit for. I don't think its more dour elements hit the point of overly depressing, and they were balanced out nicely with all the moments of spectacle. Henry Cavill makes for a great Superman, it's emotional, it's beautifully filmed, including a fantastic opening sequence on Krypton, and while it's not that completely optimistic feel reminiscent of, say, the Donner-era Superman movies, it can feel inspiring at times. And despite some criticism directed towards the amount of destruction that happens here, particularly in the third act, I will go out on a limb to defend it, considering this is meant to be a story about Superman figuring himself out and learning these big mistakes firsthand. This isn't meant to be the already established Superman who would not make these sort of mistakes from the get-go. So I understand why we got scenes of a city being destroyed while he fights Zod, who, by the way, is easily one of the best of the DCEU villains, with Michael Shannon absolutely killing it here. Overall, I don't think this is deserving of some of the hate it got at the time, and I know a lot more people have come around to it, but I think it's a really compelling, gripping superhero movie that serves as a strong starting point for the DCEU. Number 6 is Aquaman, a silly underwater adventure that feels like something akin to a cheesy 1980s action movie, and that's exactly what I liked about it. Give me something fun, silly, and over the top any day of the week, and for the most part, that's what this is. Now, don't get me wrong, this can be heartfelt and emotional at times. It's not a soulless experience by any means, as Aquaman's family history does play an integral part to the film. And it does have some solid conflicts, both with Ocean Master as well as with Black Manta, the latter of whom I really wish we got more of here. But, even with its more emotional side on display, this is a film that knows exactly what kind of movie it is and just wants you to go with it and have some fun, which is something the DCEU desperately needed at this stage in my view, as prior to this, their films would either be completely somber or would try to be a little gritty but a little fun at the same time. This goes mostly in on the fun, so I really like that. Plus, Jason Momoa was easily one of the best casting choices in this cinematic universe so far, and this is a great example of why. While you can take him seriously, he's as charismatic as ever here, and also brings with him enough winking self-awareness to give you some good laughs without it coming off as too forced or anything. Like, it sees him channeling the energy of action stars like Stallone, Schwarzenegger, and so many of their contemporaries. So I just had a blast with him here. The tone can feel occasionally uneven here and there, and it's definitely a little too long, but it doesn't hurt it this time around in the way it hurt some of the previous movies on this list, so it's still a fun time. Plus, you throw in some epic underwater battles, giant sea creatures, and the likes of Patrick Wilson, Willem Dafoe, and Nicole Kidman, and you have an awesome first solo adventure that does Aquaman justice. Number 5, Birds of Prey, a wacky, chaotic film with tons of visual flair that made for a fast-paced, wild ride. Its sense of humor is absolutely hilarious, and between that and a catchy soundtrack, it can feel like a mix of Deadpool and Guardians of the Galaxy with maybe a little John Wick thrown in there. Now, with the extended focus on Harley Quinn, at times it does feel more just like a solo movie for her that just so happens to feature the Birds of Prey, rather than being a true ensemble film. And while everyone else like Renee Montoya, Black Canary, and Huntress do get their moments to shine, and all the performances are really solid, at times it does feel like they are a little overshadowed by Harley. And in some ways, I can get why there's such an extensive focus on Harley, because Margot Robbie is great. She absolutely crushes it here with a charming, hilarious lead performance that just goes to show why she's another of the DCEU's best casting choices. But that being said, when the group's all together and the paths converge, that group dynamic is great. Plus, while maybe not always being utilized the most effectively, Ewan McGregor is also pretty solid as Black Mask, and he can be pretty scene-chewing at times, so I thought he was a good villain for the most part. While this does have its issues, what really sells it for me is its playful tone, continuing the direction taken by the last few films in the DCU to move away from the overly somber tone of the early days and just lighten things up a bit and have some fun. And it results in something that's loud, colorful, and in your face, and while for some that might not be always what they want in their superhero movies, to me, I loved it, and I thought that was all part of the charm. Number 4, Wonder Woman. And while I've been saying all through this video that the early days of the DCEU mostly felt somber more than fun, this is the one exception to the rule for me. I'd say this was the first of these films to properly mix heart, humor, and excitement to give us some old school, action-packed popcorn entertainment with an almost pulpy vibe to it. Like, the best comparison you can make for this is to the first Captain America film in the MCU, with them both following some similar structures. Though it does also contain an emotionally compelling storyline, as it focuses on Diana's quest to try finding the god of war Ares and stopping him so she can do something meaningful. But even with that emotional feel, I wouldn't call this dark. This is the first time in this universe where there was a sense of optimism as the prevailing tone. You'd see it at times in Man of Steel, and I stand by what I said just a moment ago about that movie, but that certainly went for a darker vibe, while this goes for something a bit more optimistic, with its emphasis on solid group dynamics and the spirited nature of most of these characters, mixed with some really well done, pulpy action scenes. That being said, it's still not 100% a consistent film, as I think it kind of falters a bit in its ending, with a twist that comes way too out of nowhere and can feel very jarring. It doesn't tank the movie by any means, it just causes it to not completely stick the landing. But like I said, it's still incredibly entertaining, it's a lot of fun, and it's easily the brightest spot in the DCEU's early days. Number 3 is Shazam, and this is like the antithesis of the early days of the DCEU, with it being one of the furthest things from dark, feeling more in line with a superhero version of the movie Big. With the protagonist being a young teenager, it brings with that this innocent sense of wonder and awe that makes it just feel so endearing. And it's also one of the most character-driven films in this universe thus far, with two relatable protagonists in Billy Batson and Freddie Freeman. Additionally, it's one of the funniest DCEU movies, with a much more laid-back tone and a focus on visual gags, misunderstandings, and reactions that led to so many great laugh-out-loud moments, sometimes in ways that would even subvert a few of the usual superhero tropes. And that's especially due to Zachary Levi's performance in what's easily one of his best roles to date, and one that properly showcases how much of a comedic talent he truly is. Honestly, he's someone we need to see more of in films, because he really is a great leading man. Though Jack Dylan Grazer also provides a lot of great support as well, with their dynamic being one of the most charming parts of the film. Now, one area where this is a bit weak is its villain, with Dr. Sivana being a mid-tier villain in this universe. But that being said, Mark Strong does what he can with the material, and despite only having so much to work with, he does make him feel considerably more interesting than the character actually was written. So it doesn't put him quite on the same level as some of this universe's more generic or underwritten villains, so that I appreciated. While a mostly fun watch, at the heart of this film are themes of family and finding a sense of belonging. Though despite those themes being fairly strong and consistently revisited, it's all done in a light, breezy, but still emotionally impactful way that makes this one of the DCEU's very best films. Our runner-up is Peacemaker, and honestly, I could go back and forth between this and my number 1 spot on here. But this is easily one of the best superhero shows, if not the best superhero show on TV at the moment, and even if you don't completely agree with that, you can't deny it at least has the best opening sequence of any superhero show out there. But that aside, this is just a lot of fun, and it sees James Gunn doing what he does best and taking all these ragtag characters, usually seen as outcasts by others, and just making them feel endearing, relatable, as well as characters you constantly find yourself actively rooting for. It's especially impressive considering, given how things ended off for Peacemaker in The Suicide Squad, he still finds a way to cut right to the heart of the character and while not justifying his actions in that movie by any means or asking you to excuse what he's done or come around to him immediately, it makes you understand a lot more how he ticks, and it makes his journey towards looking for redemption for himself feel organic and earned. And John Cena here, while his comedic talents have been on display in other films, if you were ever on the fence about him in other projects, this will be the one to completely change your mind and get you completely on board with him as just a fun and absolutely hilarious lead man. But what's also amazing is, you also had these minor characters from the Suicide Squad, those who worked for Amanda Waller in that movie, mainly just seen in the occasional cutaway sequence played for a joke, and they're promoted the main characters here, and you grow to like them just as much. Like, I got some good laughs from them in the Suicide Squad, but they're so much more compelling here. It's really impressive, and I really gotta commend Gunn for finding the sweet spot between these really emotional moments that touch upon things like generational trauma and PTSD, and then following them up with this really vulgar, over-the-top joke, and it just lands perfectly and doesn't take away from the moment. It's honestly brilliant, and I absolutely loved every single episode as a result. The only minor criticism I really had for this, and it's more like a nitpick, is that there's this ongoing storyline with some secondary characters that gets up here, including one character who we think is going to be this major force behind the scenes for a lot of these operations, and the way they wind up playing a part in the overall story takes this sharp about face about halfway, 3/4 of the way through, in a way that I just found to be a touch jarring. It's not done badly necessarily, and the way they go from there is great. It's just one of those things that I think could have been done just a touch better. But make no mistake, this is still an excellent show overall. I'm excited to see where season 2 goes, and like I said, it's one of, if not the, best superhero shows out there. But in first place is The Suicide Squad, an absolutely bonkers adventure from the mind of James Gunn that showed all of his wildest tendencies on full display. This is an action-packed, blood-soaked, graphically violent film with tons of dark humor that will have us laughing, but at the same time feel bad at what we're laughing at. Like, there are a number of death scenes here that wind up playing a major part in the story, but at times, they're also played for laughs, as are a number of supposedly weightier moments throughout this. Though, despite having a number of really messed up moments, at the end of the day, Gunn managed to once again do what he did with Guardians of the Galaxy, which is take these incredibly weird B and C list tier heroes, most of whom audiences are probably just hearing about for the first time with this movie, and give them these emotionally compelling arcs that we can care about. And arguably, as much as I like the Guardians movies, I think this yields better results if you ask me. And I think it's just because Gunn was able to go completely off the leash here, and given the most recent news about him being made co-CEO of DC, I think we're about to get so much more of that on display, so I'm really excited for the direction this universe is going to go. But going back to this film, the cast is absolutely stacked, with everyone from returning stars like Margot Robbie and Joel Kinnaman, to DCEU newcomers Idris Elba and John Cena, and even to James Gunn regulars like Nathan Fillion and Michael Rooker are all at the top of their game here, and they make some of the most obscure characters who could have easily just been throwaway characters feel so endearing. Like, the fact we care so much about a character called Polka Dot Man is nothing short of impressive. And this fun and charming cast is all backed by some absolutely wild visuals that make it such a consistently engaging experience from start to finish. It's hilarious, exciting, thrilling, and emotional. It's James Gunn getting to do what he does best, and it comes in as my #1 favorite film in the DCEU. But let me know, what's your ranking of the DCEU? Did you agree with this list at all? Did you disagree with it? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching, everyone, and keep having fun with film.